Recently, a 24-year-old, I may need to tread a little bit lightly here, let's say person, by the name of Randy Stair, aka Andrew Blaze as he was known on Twitter, shot and killed himself along with 3 people in a Weis grocery store in Tunkhannock, Pennsylvania. I want to mention this incident because it is the second time in recent memory where I have started to see a sort of schism form between how many commentators and skeptics and people on the right or in the center, anything even slightly right of the extreme left, handle instances of mental health crisis when it seems there is some sort of association between the perpetrator of a crime and some sort of social justice nonsense. The first being the murder of Heather Anabel at the hands of her boyfriend and co-host Alexander Kolpakov, aka Russian Deadpool, in May, all the way across the country and Colorado. What do these two desperate and seemingly unrelated events have in common? Well, both that Randy Stair and Russian Deadpool were involved in some of that very same social justice bullshit, with Russian Deadpool being a part of the Skeptic Feminist YouTube channel, and with Randy leaving behind extensive notes online between his videos and blogs and Twitter, claiming to identify as a woman and claiming to hate men. Without shooting my load a little bit too quickly, the thing that concerns me here is that I do not want to see us blaming ideology when insanity is sometimes the more obvious culprit or some other outside source outside of ideology. Leftist ideology is absolutely becoming weaponized, but we need to tread carefully here. We should not blame a crime on ideology when it is in fact more simply explained by psychosis. But we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that, so hold your horses, friends. So, of course, because of the underlying cultural Marxism that spurs both modern feminism and the rampant increase in young people believing themselves to be transgender, if for no reason other than because it is a fad, as we now know that psychologists are starting to point out and notice, yes, there are numerous reasons to believe that these two belief systems held by Russian Deadpool and by Randy Stair connected these two crimes. However, in both cases, I do not think that ideology was in any way to blame for the tragic loss of life incurred by these two individuals, and I want to make it clear that when we assess the causes of tragedy, we cannot be too quick to claim motivations to be driven as ideology only when it suits us and our narrative. We cannot fall into these same traps and the same types of tactics that the left is using against us. I have seen many people on the right or in the skeptic outlets that agree that cases like Elliot Rodger or the most recent stabbing carried out by Jeremy Joseph Christian in Portland, that both of those cases were not ideologically motivated, but were rather a fault or failure of the mental health system. Meanwhile, the left has claimed association in both of those cases with men's rights advocacy or with white supremacist beliefs. Again, in contrast though, I have seen many people state that there was no ideologically driven motivation for Elliot Rodger or Joseph Christian. Yet I have also seen there be sparse but some ideologically driven motivation attributed both to Alexander Kolpakov and significantly more now directed at Randy Stair. And some of this is coming from the very self-same people who have made those statements defending people like Elliot Rodger and Jeremy Joseph Christian. The same people who are very commonly ready and willing to illustrate and identify an ideologically driven motivation between Islamic terrorist attacks, which by the way there absolutely is. You know me, that's not what I'm stating. The point I'm actually making here is that we need to be aware of some of our own bias here when it comes to events such as these. In that, yes, it is in fact a bit more psychologically validating if you can point at a crazy fucking feminist who ends up being a crazy fucking feminist and murdering someone because obviously feminism requires some level of insanity to really believe in. But that is a very limited explanation, and it often serves as a method for us to bolster our own preconceived notions about how retarded social justice warriors are, rather than on ensuring that we analyze the nature of these events in as objective a manner as possible. And as I have said and will always say, pure objectivity is impossible. We all have biases. This is an inherent part of being human. We all have these cognitive heuristics that make up our mental neural network that we cannot abandon, that will always affect our perception of reality. However, if you want to call yourself a skeptic or you want to claim that you've got some level of objectivity, you need to apply it in all situations, not only when it is most convenient. And I might piss a lot of people off with this video, which is not my point. My point is only in sometimes we need to check our own shit. Know what I'm saying?
Julian, what the hell are these guys saying? I don't know. What are you guys saying?
All we're saying is, you know what I'm saying. See what I'm saying?
Now, I don't want to touch the whole, oh no, boo-hoo, some YouTubers make some dank jokes and I'm quitting skepticism shit with a 10-foot pole, because that entire debacle was pointless and asinine. And anyone who at this point expects V to be anything other than constantly verbally shitposting has never been paying any attention at all. I think the majority of people who were commentating on how feminism or social justice rhetoric may have been somewhat related to the murder of Heather Anable were mostly just morbidly doing that, joking at the irony of a situation wherein a self-proclaimed feminist killed his girlfriend. As a quick rundown, if you're not aware, after Russian Deadpool murdered Heather Anable, several prominent YouTubers in the skeptosphere, including V, Sargon of Akkad, and Krauton T, held a stream shooting the shit and discussing it, during which perhaps some too soon jokes were made, although, sorry, that triggering joke gets me every fucking time.
Yeah, he definitely triggered someone. He had the woman dead to rights.
There was a massive fallout coming not just from the typical whiny feminist agitators such as Fisty Splinters, but also from Thunderfoot, who used it as a nice high virtue signaling jumping off point to take his channel for a dive from. Anyway, after the event, TJ Kirk, the amazing atheist who, woo lad, what the fuck are you doing lately, did make a statement that I thoroughly agreed with and that I thought need be shared.
But I have spoken to several close friends of Heather Annabelle who come from both the feminist and anti-feminist camps, and the main concern that all of them have shared with me is they don't want to see their kind and supportive friend's grisly murder at the hands of a man she trusted be used as fodder for either side of that debate.
Which essentially is what I'm stating here. Do not attribute to ideology what is simply more easily and more logically attributable to psychoactive substance abuse or to mental health issues. Although in the case of Russian Deadpool, certainly not PTSD, or likely not PTSD, I guess, as it was reported shortly after the shooting, considering he never saw active combat. Ultimately, Russian Deadpool was a stolen valor piece of shit who had a bad trip and disgustingly ended an innocent life. I was actually quite pleased to see how very few people attributed his heinous crime to his association with feminism beyond, again, just the irony. But that was not entirely what I've seen in the instance regarding Randy Stair. If it was just V claiming it was ideologically driven, I probably would not be making this video.
Another complaint that I got from this is that apparently him being shooting people was not ideologically motivated. Well, I mean, we can agree to disagree. The guy had an entire Twitter just talking about how he hated men, like he despised men. And talked about how he hates people who misgender him, and they're bullies, and bullies should be killed because, you know, it hurts him seeing how so many bullies get away with it. And then he goes on and kills people, right? But I guess this has nothing to do with ideology. It's just, you know...
But it wasn't. It was also Paul Joseph Watson. Now, I expect Paul to be inflammatory because that's what the fuck he does. I mean, imagine my shock he said something inflammatory. But yes, Paul claimed the shooting was a product of SJW indoctrination, and to a lesser extent, I'm sorry my boy Charming Man 93 sort of did as well.
This is a person, much like the other two before, especially similar to the now dead other spree shooter. These were people who were brainwashed by extremist factions and they've committed heinous acts. These are people who are already mentally gone already, and it was this rhetoric, the things that they see in the world that's happening. It could be what they've been reading in the media that's been spinning the reality in a way that made them want to go out and kill people, or it's Tumblrisms like this guy. He's obviously been on Tumblr, he's been on sites and forums, social justice forums, where he's essentially been brainwashed to hate himself.
All of these people, you guys should know if you know me, I like and respect quite a fucking lot. And although the fucker is dead and we can't ask him why he did it, Randy Stair that is, ultimately it will always be conjecture as such. I think there is significant evidence here, and Sargon covered this in, now 2 weeks ago, This Week in Stupid, provided evidence of a severely warped psyche, with the same type of schizophrenic and incoherent lines of thought that we saw from the Portland stabber. Let me explain. Shortly after the Portland stabbing, the mainstream media lost lost their shit after finding some pro-Trump and even white supremacist-leaning posts on the social media of Jeremy Joseph Christian. But new media outlets and people like myself who can spot bullshit from a mile away were quick to note that Christian seemed to change his ideological stance more often than he changed his underoos, posting support for everyone from Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein, from Black Lives Matter to nihilism. He even claimed at one point that he had been declared sane, meaning the question had been at least broached at one point before in this man's life. He was a fucking nutter. Case closed. And all these skeptics, TM, were real fucking quick to point out that this man was not a white supremacist. He was not radicalized by the spooky and tangible alt-right. He was a fucking nutter. It's disconcerting then to see people I hold in very high regard like V and Mitch and Paul Joseph Watson seemingly so easy to attribute social justice indoctrination to the case of Randy Stair, which seems far more likely attributable to schizophrenia or some other mental health disorder, at least in my opinion and in my perception with my albeit limited understanding of clinical psychology. For example, he speaks at length about his hatred not only of himself, everything about himself, by the way, but of people and humans in general. He also claims to hate gay people, saying he is happy he truly is a woman because on some level I think that means he isn't gay. And by the way, let's break down the very fact that if he actually is suffering from gender dysphoria, that alone is enough to indicate he is having a mental health crisis, as by its very definition, gender dysphoria is a mental disorder as classified by the DSM-V. But taken all together, all these words of hate and of racism and homophobia, well, does that really sound like someone regurgitating social justice rigmarole? I mean, maybe you could call him a few genders short of a full set if you like, but this was not a mental stable person, and I find it hard to identify the impetus of his rage as ideologically motivated, when he seemed to have the same kind of grasp on said social justice ideology as Christian did on white supremacist ideology. And I think these two individuals need be handled with the same level of skepticism toward their behavior not being so easily explained away by in-group association, but rather by mental health. Absolutely, people commit atrocities when motivated by ideology. That is not what I'm questioning here. But there are instances when ideology and intergroup conflict are less likely than psychosis. Of course, there are times when it is most logical to assume ideology before mental health crisis, as such in the case with the rash of terror attacks increasing in frequency across Europe, because, frankly speaking, the ideology shared across the entire group of people committing these repugnant acts of violence hells them to. When you read the Quran and the Hadith, this call to violence is evident. So evident, in fact, that I'm not really sure which verse I could pick out to illuminate just how prevalent the call to violence is. So instead, I'll probably just have some kind of scroll here. Yeah, like around this area. This is a system of faith that these people share and are raised in. And in the system, these words in these holy books, they are immutable. They are the permanent word of God, of Allah. They are unquestionable in the interpretation by virtue of God's word being infallibly correct. When you recognize this about the doctrines of Islam, it is easy to see an act of terror occur for the umpteenth time as the attacker shouts Allahu Akbar and pretty much instantly recognize it as an ideologically driven act of violence and terror. However, when it comes to cases like Randy Stair or Jeremy Christian, the motive is not so easily discernible, and to claim as such, I believe, is potentially dangerous. To look at these cases in abstract only when they seem to fit our narrative. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into these same traps of confirmation bias that we both see and accuse the left and cultural Marxists and social justice warriors of all the time. Rather, we need actually be skeptical in instances as nuanced and complex as these two and many others in these hideous destructions of human life. And this is another big reason for this video, because you know what is second in repulsivity to that destruction of human life? They are the subhuman parasites who leech off of it to actually promote some sort of political or ideologically driven narrative. Stair and Christian were pieces of shit, but they were also insane. That doesn't excuse them for their crimes, not in the least, but it does help explain them. It is why we have something called the insanity plea. People in certain mental states are cognitively incapable of making logical judgments. Again, it is not an excuse, it's an explanation. I would mention, though, that anyone who goes out there and decides to murder somebody probably has some mental health issues in the first place, be it insecurity or self-hatred, depression, or something far less serious than the depths of mental instability that I think we see in individuals like Randy Stair and Christian. But again, the real pieces of shit here, the actual real pieces of shit that I have the most contempt for, at least as far as I'm concerned, they're the ones who continually use instances of violence or tragedy to forward their narrative by scaffolding politics onto these disturbed individuals. In these cases, the real ideologically driven malfeasance is coming, as I have noted, from social justice retards who use these tragedies to further their agenda. For example, as V mentioned in his response video to the Randy Stair thing, there are social justice warriors all over Tumblr. How the fuck is that site still around in current year, by the way? Decrying the fact that Randy is not being portrayed as a trans woman or is being misgendered by the very scant, and this is important, scant media coverage that the case has received. And yes, I do want to say, I think that's part of the reason that no one outside of YouTube is even mentioning this shooting. That definitely is an ideological spin coming from the mainstream media in their unwillingness to cover it. Because if they did cover it, they would have to refer to Randy as a trans woman, lest they face this same wrath of these ravenous animals chomping at the bit for any chance to call someone a transphobe. And that's exactly why you're never going to hear anything about Randy Stair. It's exactly because of that. The mainstream media cannot report on it because they would have to say he identified as a trans woman, and the YouTubers who report on it, it is a little bit convenient to point out his social justice leaning sort of postings as an ideologically driven motivation for his heinous acts. But I just don't think that's necessarily the case here. But I'm getting off track. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about these fucking social vultures that prey off of these crimes. They are the real cancer that we need to address and that we actually do need to castigate, like the blood-sucking leeches they are. It's not just Randy, it was with Russian Deadpool as well. Was it not that the whole fucking debacle when it came right down to it, and yes, sure, V's gonna V and make tasteless if hilarious jokes, but that no one was mocking Heather Anable nor making light of her death, well, at least no one in the stream that caused the kerfuffle between the skeptics and the feminists and virtue signalers like Thunderfoot. No one actually ever said anything to dishonor her, nor to blame feminism or social justice as far as I can tell, and I've gone through, I saw almost no blame on feminism. Some, but very little. And very little beyond some gallows humor concerning the morbidly ironic nature of the event. And yes, what happened in response? Well, every feminist on YouTube lost their collective shit to use the death of an innocent in a pathetic attempt to discredit people like Sargon and Crowton T and V. Why? Because they are carrion animals circling around the death of others in desperation to pull a little bit of fucking rotting flesh just to virtue signal a little. To get in just an edge of moral superiority over everyone else. Because that is what leftism does to people. Trade in your brain along with your heart for the ability to perpetually feel superior to everyone around you, intellectually and morally. And that is exactly why they use tragedies like this in this manner as opportunities to attempt to usurp a moral high ground, all while of course engaging in all types of heinous bullshit activities like doxing themselves, which we know at this point they pretty much unilaterally support. It is in part to not disrespect the victims, in part to be fair and balanced in our coverage of topics, in part not to be dismissive of the real issues of mental health which are particularly prevalent in the United States mental health system, and in very much a very big part to not allow these dregs of society to feed off our own potential for confirmation bias, as we all have as human beings. They will absolutely jump down your throat and use any misstep or misrepresentation to malign anyone who disagrees with their narrative. It is a bit shit, but if you're going to go around calling yourself a skeptic or a rationalist or what the fuck ever, I don't give a shit. Not a crazy leftist. It's unfortunate and it's more difficult, but the intellectual high road must be taken, if for no reason other than to prevent these pieces of human filth from using tragedy, real tragedy, to support their shitty agenda. So V, PJW, Charmy, perhaps we will have to agree to disagree on the case of Randy Stair. As I said, he offed himself, so it's all just a pointless speculation game. Anyway, we can't ask him. But I wanted to make this video just as a word of warning, not to fall down the same path as those that we are fighting against. What I see happening a lot recently is the skeptic community has entered a new period that I think I'm going to call the age of drama.
It's drama time. No, V, no.
The original enemy that spawned the preponderance of these YouTube channels, that is feminism and anti-Gamergate, has been thoroughly destroyed. Everyday feminism is dying. There are far few teenage bedroom feminists spouting lessons from their freshman gender studies courses, and regardless of your take on Lacey Green, I know I trust her about as far as I could throw them tiggled biddies, she, arguably, the face of feminism on YouTube, has switched sides. And although originally there was talk of these conversations that were supposed to happen, considering how other feminists have lambasted and ostracized her, I doubt much dialogue, at least openly, is going to occur. I really, trust me, I've said this before, I certainly hope she's sincere. I'm just not convinced. Debunking feminism has been the bread and butter of a lot of channels on YouTube for a very long time, and I think we have entered an age of common respite. And historically, do you know what happens when the external enemy is defeated? Infighting, which again historically destroys empires. I do not want to see skeptics, rationalists, whatever the fuck term you want to define yourselves as, fall victim to these same easy tactics utilized by the left. Yes, again, they are easy, they are convenient, they are comfortable. For example, while I found the Trump Caesar performance distasteful, it is still free expression, and I believe it is very far outside of the realm of treason. Now, Kathy Griffin, maybe we could talk some treason there, but the Caesar performance? Sorry, it's a 400-year-old play. It's art. As such, to interrupt that free expression means sinking to the same levels as those we have criticized for those very same actions. We cannot allow ourselves to fall into these gerbil traps.
You are all Goebbels! You are all Nazis like Joseph Goebbels! This is Goebbels! You are all Goebbels! You are inciting...
Just because the first major victory has been achieved. What do you think, lady? Should we allow ourselves to fall in these gerbil traps? What do you think, my little gerbil?
Und wenn die jüdischen Zeitungen heute glauben, auf versteckte Drohungen die nationalsozialistische Bewegung einschüchtern zu können, sie sollen sich hüten!
Of course, the counter-argument is that, well, Aiden, the left is going to call us racist, literal Hitlers anyway. Why should we not resort to their tactics? And admittedly, I can't give you a good answer there, beyond to emphasize the importance of actually maintaining morality, rather than just virtue signaling your faux morality, of trying to get as far up in this moral superiority hierarchy as the left does. You can't engage in that. We cannot allow ourselves to be morally compromised. My point is, even with the enemy, the original enemy, pretty much defeated, realizing that feminism being retarded is pretty much the softest and most palatable red pill out there, rather than resorting to the same type of shitty tactics used by the left, there is still an extremely present threat of cultural Marxism and radical leftist thought that is present, that we need be hyper-vigilant of. Because there is more than just one type of the barbarian at the gate of Western civilization survival. You cannot usurp their tactics. And the crazy thing is, when I was originally writing this video, or thinking about writing it, of fucking course, a burnout shot up a Republican baseball game. Obviously driven by ideology and a hatred of right-leaning politicians, if not conservatives in general, if not anyone to the right of Marx. Obviously, this was an ideologically driven crime. This is not Randy Stair. This is not Jeremy Christian. This was ideology. And what the fuck did I find? Oh, well, turns out the culture vultures I was just referring to not only are quick to use violence committed by the mentally ill, but are also willing to just straight up use obviously ideologically driven crime also to promote their shitty narrative in absolute utter irreverence to those injured and to the potential moral consequences that, thankfully, were avoided in this incident. And yes, in the case of the left, I do understand why it is easy to think that all crimes committed by left-leaning individuals are unilaterally attributable to a vitriolic ideology. After all, as we have seen become more and more pervasive in the mainstream cultural stage since the election of Donald Trump, the left has immersed itself in violent rhetoric, imagery, and ultimately behavior. From the very induction of Trump into the White House with Madonna expressing her fevered desire to blow it up, to pathetic washed-up hag Kathy Griffin holding a mannequin's severed head as the media has become inundated with violence towards the right being praised. But because I know I'm about to do a video with Hard Bastard about one of Anita Sarkeesian's new video manifestations of literal shit, wherein I'm going to criticize her heavily for her absolute ignorance in the field of media psychology, I must of course make the same point here, for cohesion and honesty. As friends, I will truly always try to be honest with you. Media psychology and social psychology at large deals in extremely small effect sizes. That means that even in the best conditions with the best methodology, we consistently seen that exposure to media has very little effect on long-term behavioral outcomes. This meta-analysis, which analyzed 322 meta-analyses, including 8 million participants, produced an average effect size of 0.20 for aggression research, and aggression is in fact one of the most researched topics in media and social psychology. An effect size of 0.20 or 0.20. That's nothing. Again, though, this is aggression, not violence, and we have yet to show a direct causal link between aggression and violence. And we also measure aggression in some very poor ways, such as playing a loud noise or blowing air in the ear of another person. These data are not definitive, and due to the flaws in instrumentation and measurement, even with all those issues, we still end up with a correlation and R value of 0.20. Yes, as I said, a small effect size. Short-term arousal, and depending on how you measure it, aggression, yes, we do see that. But changes in behavior long-term? No, the data do not support that hypothesis. There is some better evidence to suggest that children may have long-term effects from witnessing violent media, but not adults, not to the same capacity. Interestingly enough, and one of the reasons I do enjoy media psychology is because the long-term effects we generally do find are fairly positive. See the parasocial contact hypothesis. In that exposure to positive portrayals of stigmatized groups can lead to a stigma-holding viewer who has had little to no personal experience with that group, generally improving his or her perception toward said group. In such cases, we find that that is in fact one of the first steps to decreasing negatively valence perceptions of an outgroup in those who have had little personal interactive experiences with said outgroup. My point is that the media can only do so much. For all of our research, generally speaking, outside of massive repeated contact resulting in the formation of cognitive heuristic pathway development that is consistent association creating neural links between concepts, generally speaking, these effect sizes are negligible. Simply put, the media doesn't actually affect us all that much. So what is the real issue here? As much as I like to blame leftist radicalization on the ivory tower and academe, I think it is also in large part due to the fact that the left now has no power base. They have spent the last year and a half destroying themselves, and they seem keen to continue to do so. From their obsession with identity politics to their ideologically driven purity litmus tests to just their complete and utter lack of self-awareness and goal orientation in the power vacuum that they themselves have created and placed themselves in. It makes them desperate. I just needed to take an aside here to mention this, because I have also seen a number of outlets claim that the media is the cause of any left-wing violence, and knowing what I know about media psychology, I'm sorry, I cannot give credence to that notion. I find that to be scientifically inaccurate. Particularly, I believe it is important that we do not simply blame leftist media, because again, it would lower us to the position of these social justice types that we have criticized, like Anita Sarkeesian, who claim that television and video games are the cause of all the world's evils, of all this racism and sexism. It is Jack Thompson tier lunacy that is wholly not based on the quantitative empirical data that we have ample examples to provide evidence to the contrary to. That is that media is not wholly the problem here. It is the culture of this power vacuum, and it is indoctrination. Not long ago, I mentioned that I thought we could look at the left's ongoing temper tantrum as a manifestation of the stages of grief. But this is not what we are seeing now. Rather than moving forward, they are regressing, as progressives are wont to do after all, back toward base violence and anger. It is because they are hopeless, and it is a hopelessness on some level many of them must know that they themselves created. And as such, right now, they are teetering on the line of a dangerous precipice of outright espousing death and violence in a desperate attempt to reclaim their lost power. Back to the case of the Scalise shooting, though, the fact that no one was fatally injured in that shooting, likely, in my perception, was part of the reason that these ideologues were so quick to use it as a method of sharing their political agenda by claiming it was somehow righteous. Although I still don't really quite get how the hamster wheel of, should be gerbil wheel I suppose, of cognitive dissonance is spinning around, given the fact that the 2 officers who were shot were black and one of them a lesbian, since that certainly doesn't fit with the narrative. Since, as we know, all black people hate conservatives and all LGBTQ people hate conservatives, but also all black people are LGBTQ people apparently, because skin color is now officially part of the sexuality spectrum? What?
Am I glad he's frozen in there and that we're out here and that he's the sheriff and that we're frozen out here and that we're in there and I just remembered we're out here. What I want to know is where's the caveman?
Anyway, here's the real takeaway from these tweets from these pseudonymous supporters of this violent rhetoric and behavior, which is, after all, so easy to do behind a computer screen as de-individuation research has indicated for so long. In doing so, and in praising the shooter, you are painting yourselves in the same coat of blood red paint as ISIS. You are actively supporting domestic terrorism. You are calling for a civil war. And as I have said, and I will say again, if you truly want to start a war in this country, go ahead, try it. Just remember which side supports the NRA and which side supports shit like PETA.
She had nobody there for her. She was crying. She was scared every single moment. And because her usefulness had run out, she was going to be killed. Someone was going to murder her. And I can see you smiling, and I can see you laughing. But to her, this is not funny. I went in there with other humans and I took her out of there. And if I hadn't, she wouldn't be with me right now. She would be gone, just like all of her sisters, just like everybody who we left behind.
And for those on Twitter trying desperately to use this attack as a way to spread their narrative, all while showing a total lack of concern not only for the lives of the Louisiana whip Steve Scalise, who weirdly called for harsher crackdowns on pedophiles.
While many of us would like to believe that this issue isn't something that affects us, the sad truth is that human trafficking is a real problem plaguing each and every community here in the United States. Enough is enough. This week, the House took strong actions to stand up for the victims of human trafficking, passing tough bills to provide them protection and to target child predators. Let's work together to get these bills signed into law.
Alex Jones, could you please stop being right for once? But also, for the 2 black Capitol Police officers who took metal for him, you, Twitter social justice warrior, trying to explain how this was a virtuous action, understand this. You're on the verge of starting a civil war, and that's not a joke, you really are. And it is not a civil war that you want to fight, nor one that you can win. Look, I've said this, I'm a pacifist. I'm certainly not looking for a war. But if you continue it at this pace, be warned, you're gonna start one. Because this was not solely the actions of a simple madman. This is no Randy Stair. This is no Jeremy Christian. I think at this point we can say that definitively this was an ideologically driven assault. It was not created by the media. I would accept it was media influenced but not driven. It was driven by hopelessness. And hopelessness is truly one of the most dangerous positions a person can be in. For without hope, what is there to toss in your life away? This is what we should actually be concerned with when we think of leftist, rhetoric-driven violence. Not Randy Stair. This was the first shot. I just hope it doesn't become the Fort Sumter of a new American conflict. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. I'm Aiden Paladin, Altana Volt.